Excess body fat is not simply a cosmetic issue, and helping a pet reach a healthier body condition is really as simple as telling an owner to feed less and exercise more. Today, I'm speaking to Dr. Ernie Ward, the founder of the Association for Pet Obesity Prevention. We discuss how to recognize unhealthy excess body fat, why pets gain weight, and what it is doing medically, and why so many weight loss attempts fail, what a realistic long-term plan should actually look like. This is not about making animals thin for appearance. It is about protecting movement, comfort, health, and quality of life. Let's get started. So, Dr. Ward, you have argued that words such as chunky and chubby and fluffy can make excess body fat sound harmless, while simply labeling animals as obese can actually make owners feel judged and just shut down. So what language should we be using that is medically honest without making owners feel blamed?
That's a great question. And our language does impact our clinical outcomes. And we know this historically from decades of research in human obesity medicine. And in fact, it even goes further back than that. One of the examples I like to use about the power of language and how it changes our perception and ultimately our treatments and outcomes goes back to diabetes. And so when you start to look at the medical literature, especially around the turn of the century, and when people were describing this, obviously diabetes has been around since mankind has been around. And suddenly, the medical terminology was describing people with diabetes as diabetics. And it really started to create a barrier, a causality. People, physicians would blame the patient. And yet we now know, of course, clearly there are many causes of diabetes. There are, you have type 1 and type 2. You have external factors. You have all types of alterations in hormones and metabolism and organ function. And so what happened was in the 1950s, they started recognizing we're creating a barrier with language to our patients. And so they started really evaluating how they addressed and thought of and discussed with diabetic patients. And so they started saying, we need to start to address the people first. And that's literally where that whole people first language came from. And so they said, it's people living with diabetes. It's people with diabetes. And so as we march forward, in time, we've applied that to cancer. We've applied that, of course, famously now in obesity and other types of diseases. And what it really does is it shifts the emphasis on causality, right? And so when you call someone obese, it's not only a judgment, but it's actually implying that somehow you are the root cause. You made this happen to yourself. And so again, in the 1970s and 80s, physicians started evaluating their language more critically, and they said, hey, we need to put people first, like we've done with other diseases. We don't call a person with cancer a cancer person, for example. We say you have a certain type of cancer. And so really all I did, and I've been involved with human obesity groups since I started this journey over 25 years ago in veterinary obesity. And one of the things I learned was dealing with pediatric obesity, this language barrier was very profound and significant. And so I really just started applying those tenets, about 15 years ago, and really encouraging my colleagues to evaluate how we were describing. And so, we're making inroads. We now, the Association for Pet Obesity Prevention, we published a comprehensive communication guidelines. And we have these not only for our professional colleagues, but also for people in the media, for marketing firms. I was really, I'll tell you, Dr. Kara, you're making a small dent in the world. I was recently approached by a marketing company that was doing a campaign. They have a future campaign for a big company in the United States and Europe. And they said, hey, we just wanted you to know we actually removed all references to obese dog, obese cats, and we replaced it with dogs and cats with obesity. And you really helped change our mindset on that. So again, just getting back to those terms like chunky, it can trivialize a very serious, debilitating disease, right? It can sort of underscore and undermine the impact that we're trying to do, as far as clinically. So if we want to do a nutritional intervention, diagnostic testing, follow-ups, reassessments, if we sort of say, oh, he's just a little fluffy, we really haven't made it a serious condition at all. And so that's one of the things that people that are listening and watching today, I really hope you will just think about the language we use to describe it. And I really just always kind of go back and say, imagine replacing obesity with cancer, and how would you address that client and that patient? And I think if you can reframe it along those lines, then you'll be much more effective in your communication.
So before we talk about why pets gain weight, let's make sure people know what they're actually looking for at home. What would you say is the clearest way an owner can assess at home whether their dog or cat may be carrying unhealthy or excess body fat?
Yeah, and one of the tools, that we've developed over many, many years, over the last 25 years at petobesityprevention.org. They're free tools, and we actually will guide you, a pet owner, a veterinary professional, step by step how to do this. We have diagrams and pictures and all sorts of, resources that can help explain this. But really, there are three main things that if you're at home as a pet parent, you want to look for. The first thing you want to do is what I call the tummy tuck, right? You want to look at your dog or cat from the side when they're standing up in a normal posture, and you should see a slight elevation or an upward trend of the abdomen, the lower abdomen in particular. And this is my most important cardinal sign because, it's that belly fat that's the most harmful to our pets and, of course, to humans as well. The second thing I want you to do is the hourglass test. So look at your dog or cat from above while they're standing, and you should see a slight undulation and indentation sort of around the hips and the ribs. It should just slightly go in a little bit just to inside. And the reason that's important is because we're also looking at that belly fat. And so a lot of times they're carrying extra weight here that can be harmful. And then the final thing we do is the hip check. So basically you want to feel around your dog or cat's hips and sort of the caudal thigh, the backs of their legs, and really feel if you can, if there's a big mound of fat, if you're going through jello, that can be a real problem. Now, a lot of my colleagues, including myself, we do like to do the rib check. So you may see your veterinarian actually feel the ribs, but I think this can be hard for many pet owners because it can be sort of, it varies greatly. Breeds vary greatly, dog and cat age, all these things, a lot of variables. But I do tell my colleagues, I say, look, it's a little bit like, the ridges of your knuckles here. You should be able to feel a slight indentation, but you can do the rib check at home if you like. But I think if you'll just do the tummy tuck, if you'll look at that hourglass figure and do the hip check, you'll be good.
And why is the number on the scale not enough on its own?
Yeah, great question, Dr. Kara. And I'll tell you, we are not chasing a number on a scale. This is not about weight. This is about body fat and body composition. So, if we just evaluate, if you just, again, look at yourself or myself, and we just take our weight, that puts us in what's called a body mass index, right? So we'll take our height and our weight. They kind of put in some approximations, and that gets you somewhere, but it doesn't tell you accurately, are you sort of holding on to the unhealthy forms of fat, especially that visceral fat around the organs in the abdomen, the belly fat, okay? And so for me, it's never been about weight. It's never been about chasing a number on a scale. It's really about evaluating that pet patient in front of me and trying to determine where are they having or storing or holding that extra fat. And again, Dr. Kara, as you know, too often, we see these dogs and cats, they have excess visceral adiposity is the medical term that we use, but that extra bit of belly fat, and that's going to put them as a predisposition if they're a cat for type 2 diabetes, if they're a dog for all forms of hypertension and respiratory disorders, osteoarthritis. I mean, it really, one of the things I think that's been so, I guess enlightening over the last 25 years is to understand the causality, right? Those extra few pounds of fat that your dog or cat is holding on to, that's actually leading to and causing many preventable diseases. And that's really what this is about, preventing harm.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I know we're going to unpack a lot of these and we'll go into some detail, but before we do, what should owners understand about body condition and muscle condition as two different measurements?
Yeah, and great point, because these are two different things. Body condition is basically looking at body fat or adiposity. So we're using that to evaluate, is your dog or cat, do they have adequate stores of body fat? Because we do need some, obviously, just to maintain and live. Or do they have excessive amounts that can cause harm? Muscle condition is looking really at loss of lean muscle mass. So there are several sites that we use. In fact, if you go to the World Pet Obesity Association at worldpetobesity.org, we actually have all these elaborate charts. You can find them at petobesityprevention.org as well. But these charts really are looking at muscle loss, and this can accompany obesity, which is interesting because a lot of people think, I'm more worried about the extra body fat. We're actually worried about the extra body fat combined with the loss of skeletal muscle, because this leads to frailty, Dr. Kara. And you and I know this. We see this too often. We see this 13-year-old cat, okay, and it's carrying too much weight. It's had obesity for, many, many years, and now they can't get in the litter box. They can't jump up and walk around. And that's due to what we call sarcopenic obesity. They're losing muscle, but yet they're holding on to excess body fat.
Mm, so true. And I mean, even though we know the signs and the gradual change is hard to see, and we know, we look at it every day, why do so many of us miss it?
Yeah, and Dr. Carr, I think you actually identified a key tenet to why we miss it, because this is a slow accumulation of body fat, right? I mean, days don't notice it, right? Months start to sort of, you maybe notice a little, but years normalize it. And so basically after your dog or cat has gained the first couple of pounds, it gets increasingly difficult to spot additional fat gain. And so for me as a veterinarian, that's why it's so important to have a good relationship with your vet. They should be doing body condition and muscle condition scoring every visit, right? Because these things are gradual, and the time to take intervention steps, right? The time to put them on therapeutic weight loss diets or exercise programs or whatever the case may need is going to be when they've just gained those first few pounds. Because, Dr. Cara, it's sad. The physiological math is pretty simple. And we know that dogs and cats at best can only lose a set amount of body fat or body weight per month. And we know that because if we go faster than that, we start to lose muscle mass, which gets us back into frailty and other complications, including a life-threatening form of liver disease in cats. But when we look at the math, for dogs, it's about 3 to 5% of that body weight per month is about all we can ever achieve safely. But for cats, it's really more like 1 to 3%. We kind of target around 2.5%, but that adds up to about a half a pound a month. And so, you can see why if they've got to lose 5 pounds, man, that's going to take months and months. And that's why it's much better to take this initiative, take intervention early, and start as soon as you notice that first couple of pounds.
Absolutely. The Pause and Effect podcast is about helping pet owners make more informed decisions. And that is also the thinking behind Just for Pets. The products are selected and vet approved through Hillcrest Veterinary Hospital, with support available when you need that more than a product description and a checkout button. Vet approved, pet adored. Get it all to your door. Find them online at justforpets.co.za. You've done surveys that repeatedly show that vets identify far more overweight pets than owners do. Why is gradual weight gain so difficult for us to see in our own animals? And does increasing number of heavier pets around us gradually change what we perceive as normal?
Yeah, back in the day, we used to call this the obesity gap. And so I was trying to describe, when we first were doing our national surveys in the United States, I was trying to describe why did people miss it, So you would go in and part of our survey is we ask the owner to assess their dog or cat's body condition. We just say, are they a healthy weight? Are they a thin? Are they too heavy? Or they have obesity, right? So just simple, how do you gauge it? And we kept seeing this big gap. So the veterinarian would classify them based on a body condition score as having obesity, and the owner would say they're healthy, ideal. And why is that? And I think it's because when we're looking at our own pets every day, day in and day out, we don't know what normal looks like. And I would say, in fact, one of the studies we did many, many years ago, we started looking at pictures of some of the dogs that had won some of the big dog shows around the world over time. And if you look at them closely and study them, you will see a gradual, as we used to call it, a shift to the right towards increase in body mass. And so I do think that that dogs and cats today are larger than they were, but more importantly, they've been accepted. And so what would have been normal back, 20 years ago is now considered, too thin. And what's overweight today would be, obviously very, very have obesity, 20 years ago. And, it's interesting when you look at pediatric human studies on this, you find the same kind of thing. It's like, children of the 50s, 60s, and 70s looked different. Parents categorized them differently. So again, societally, we do tend to adapt and adjust and normalize. And I think you're absolutely right, Dr. Cara. There's definitely been a trend, as we say, a shift towards the right in overall body mass. But again, we really want to focus on body fat. And that's where it gets us back to assessing body composition, body condition. And, once you start to sort of look at your own pet on an individual basis and assessing its own adiposity or body fat, then that's where really you can make the change.
I agree. And are there particular body shapes, breeds, or coat types that make it particularly difficult to misread?
Yeah, a great point. Because, when you look at dog sizes in particular, right? Because cats tend to be pretty much consolidated around a tight band, and we'll talk about that in a second. But dog body size, body mass varies 40 times. So if you take a Chihuahua all the way up to a Great Dane or a Mastiff, there's 40 times difference. And so obviously the perception of that is very difficult because, we don't know how to adjust. And then you look at a very lean dog like a Whippet or a Greyhound or something like that obviously is thin, has this long appendicular or skeletal, their legs are long and their long necks, it's more easy to spot fat on them. But then you take a little chondrodysplastic like a Frenchie or a pug or a bulldog who are sort of more rotund and compact already. Well, now it gets difficult to determine, are they carrying extra body fat, particularly around the abdomen and belly? And so, that wide range of phenotypes, as we call it, or physical shapes and breeds, really can make it more confounding. Now, for cats, it's a lot tighter because we've domesticated them, and they really sort of settled on this body mass between about 8 and 12 pounds. That's typically normal. We do some skeletal or axial measurements as well. So in general, cats are typically from the base of their tail to the base of their skull around 19 to 21 inches. And I apologize if those are American numbers, but I'm in America. But regardless, we know that cats tend to have a lot more, sort of concentration around certain body phenotypes. Obviously, we have, outliers. We have, all types of Maine Coon cats, and then you have some very smaller cats and so forth. But we do think that most of this boils down, though, to genetics, right? And so we've already identified several genes or gene deletions or extra copies of these of these genetic markers that do tend to coincide with obesity. Obviously, that's an area of active interest and research. And one of the things that we go into great detail in an upcoming textbook that I have on this. But I will say, Dr. Carr, at the end of the day, we should settle more on less its breed predisposition and more genetic factors for the individual.
How interesting. So when we started our conversation about talking about the terms that maybe historically or still we use in South Africa to refer to these pets as sort of, and I understand because I've personally used them as sort of a way of approaching the conversation. But how can a vet raise body condition without making the owner feel that their love, their feeding, or their competence is being judged?
Yeah, great point. We don't want to blame and shame when it comes to obesity, because one of the problems with how most of us interact with our pets is that we sort of equate food and treats with love and affection. And that makes it a problem whenever you say, I want you to reduce some of those activities. And I will say, for me, the first thing that I want to do is, this is where precision in language becomes essential. When we talk about chunky and fluffy and a little heavy, you can see, again, that trivialization of it then makes the next part of the conversation less impactful, right? Because now it's not as serious, because it's kind of, hey, we could all, stand to lose a few pounds kind of thing. And that doesn't move the needle. That doesn't take action. In fact, the next time you see that dog or cat, they will have gained another 2 or 3 pounds, which now could put them at even further risk for developing some of these conditions. So the first thing I want to do is acknowledge that we have permission to have this conversation. If you take away nothing, if you're a veterinary colleague today, you need to start by asking, is this something you want to talk about today? So, Mrs. Smith, obviously, we love seeing you and Buster here at our clinic, and we've been tracking the weight, and I do that body condition score. That's what I was talking about just a few minutes ago. And unfortunately now, I am getting concerned. Buster, has obesity. And is that something that you'd like to talk about today? I mean, obviously, I want to maybe give you some ideas on how we can improve his overall health and reduce some of that extra body fat that may be causing harm. But I just want to make sure, that you have the time and interest in talking about that today. Dr. Carr, that disarming phrase of gaining permission can really help improve the outcomes. And I will say this as a veterinarian, many times, even though I'm expert in this area, I'll have clients that will say, Dr. Ward, I know I need to feed him a little less or exercise more or whatever, right? They'll always have the excuse, but they're not ready to have that conversation. They may not be ready for another year. But then sometimes, like the next week, you get a phone call. So get permission. The second thing is to help them understand this is a disease state that is independent of their actions, and their actions may help improve it. It's sort of like, a person who has lung cancer and is smoking, right? And so you would automatically, hopefully, if you're a physician, say, we need to stop smoking because this is making things worse or whatever. It's maybe going to lead to additional cancer. Who knows? But the reality there is we wouldn't hesitate to say, listen, you got lung cancer and you're smoking, the first thing you can do is stop smoking. No, I doubt if very many people would probably argue with me on that point. But yet we hesitate to have that conversation with pets, right? And so by making it a precise nomenclature, a precise medical condition with precise types of interventions, in this case right now, it would be lifestyle management. So maybe a therapeutic weight loss diet, maybe increase in activity. There's a lot of things, maybe checking for thyroid function in a dog, for example. But regardless, I want to make sure that we don't blame and shame them, all right? And then we're going to give them real simple steps. The one thing I've learned over all these years is that you can't give them the entire menu. You can't say, we got to do this and this and this and this. You really have to start small and start accessible. And that's one of the things why, years ago, Dr. Cara, I was struggling with these patients because we'd put them on these therapeutic weight loss diets. And back then, the target would be like if they were X pounds, it was X minus Y and Z was what we targeted, right? That was going to be the ideal weight, let's just say, for example. And so when you start to take that kind of caloric reduction, these dogs and cats were mutiny, right? I mean, they were pestering and begging and getting up all in the middle of the night. I mean, we've all been there. And so one of the things that we started doing by accident, 25 years ago, was we said, look, maybe let's break that into chunks. And at the time, I started breaking into 3-month intervals. Really just did it because it was easy math. It was easier math for me. But what we've now know through the research is that actually there were metabolic plateauing. There were all kinds of behavioral shifts that were occurring whenever calories were restricted. And so by using what we call a step weight loss plan, and again, we have all these amazing calculators on our websites for veterinary professionals to use, but if we broke it down into smaller plateaus, smaller little increment steps, then we avoided a lot of these metabolic plateaus, we avoided a lot of the begging and pestering, and we had better outcomes in the end. And so I would say if you're sitting there today saying, how do I even start as a veterinary professional, really consider a step weight loss program because, again, this will help the body adapt more easily to changes in calories and preserve lean muscle mass, which I keep coming back to that. You've mentioned it a couple of times with muscle condition, but that is really the grail here, right? Our goal is to reduce body fat and preserve muscle mass. And that can only be done through a very deliberate, intentional step. And I think what will happen is, for me at least, whenever I say, look, we only want to reduce the calories by about 20 or 30 calories, right? I mean, it may be that small in many of these smaller dogs and cats. We just really want to cut the calories 30, 50 calories a day. Suddenly now that becomes actionable. That becomes doable to that client. Instead of saying you can't feed any more treats, you can't feed any of this diet or whatever, you can really start to make it something that they can understand and hopefully they'll adhere to longer term. But, I will say this, Dr. Cara, no matter how precise we are in language, no matter how empathetic and compassionate we are, not everyone is ready for this conversation or action at any given time. And number two, you're still going to have a large cohort of clients who just say, no, this isn't for me. And I will say this as a veterinarian to a veterinarian, that's okay. You cannot win them all. You really do need to give yourself grace. The only thing I will ever, really encourage our veterinarians to do is to have this conversation with clients, right? If you fail to have that conversation because of fear, well, now I have a problem with that. But if you have these conversations, and even if you meet with rejection, if you're still doing it in a caring, compassionate, empathetic fashion, most people walk out of that room going, yeah, I'm not going to put him on a diet. No, I'm not going to buy that food, whatever, right? But they're not angry with you because you led with compassion. You said, hey, is this something you want to talk about? And then again, if you'll just take those step-by-step little approaches, I think you'll, little small nuggets, you'll do better.
So would you say that photographs, you said visually it's nice. I love the way you describe the tummy tuck and the hourglass. Those are things that, I think we can all picture in our heads. And I think those are great ways to describe what owners should be looking for. But because the changes are gradual, including weight gain and weight loss, especially with your method, and I'm hoping we can unpack that a little bit further, are photographs from above and from the side useful for spotting gradual changes that are difficult to see day by day?
Great question. Now, there's two parts to this. So are they for noticing and diagnosing? Absolutely. So trending looks good for gain. Where it fails us, though, is on the loss. And that is because the perception is very difficult to discern. So now suddenly the cat lost a pound and we're celebrating and the owner can't see a difference. That's a problem. I will tell you what I anchor it in though, Dr. Cara. I anchor it in activities. And this works really well, of course, with dogs, but cats, it applies as well. So what I do when I'm starting this journey, the person has given me permission. We're mapped out a step weight loss plan, right? We've got some action. We've got a therapeutic diet in mind. Well, all those little steps, right? The first thing that I do, and I do this subtly, and I don't do it, out loud where everybody knows what I'm asking, but I say things like, all right, let me ask you this. So like, what's the one thing that you wish Buster could do, that he's suddenly stopped doing? I mean, is there anything, hopping up in the car, playing ball in the park, and same thing for cats. Are they able to get in the litter box? Are they able to jump up on the couch or the counters, whatever it is that they do? I try to anchor it in some action because as we move forward, that's going to be the thing that I keep coming back to. So how's Buster doing? Is he able to pop up in the car now? And once they start to hit those kind of milestones, that's when the lights go off in everybody's head. They go, oh my gosh, Buster's doing something different. And so, Dr. Carr, I do think that obviously imaging helps us, but I don't know how impactful. It's certainly, we've tried this over the years many, many times, and we just found the perception gap was pretty great, and people didn't see anything. Oh, if you say so, Dr. Ward, he still looks pretty chunky to me, right? So they're still in that mindset. But for me, if I can go back and say, Buster is doing something that he couldn't do, that you feel like he lost. Because for me, this is a quality of life issue. It always has been. I want to help restore being a dog to that dog with obesity. I want to help restore the joy of being a cat to that cat with obesity. And that, to me, is anchored in activity and actions in the real world.
I love that. I'm definitely going to utilize that. That's not even something that I've even thought of, because I think we've been so focused, even I will make the admission, I've worked with a fitness coach who also requests my photographs where you stand awkwardly and they can see the change, and you're going, I'm not sure about this. Just as you described, our clients might do with their pets. But I love that activity.
And I'll tell you, Dr. Carr, I'm also a certified personal trainer, and you're absolutely right. That's how we are taught, okay? But the reason that works in humans is because of aesthetics and, quite frankly, vanity, right? And so they know that most people that are doing this weight loss journey throughout most periods of their lives, especially up to young adulthood, they are doing it because they want to look good at the beach or whatever, right? And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I'm saying that I think that it works better with humans than it does with dogs, because dogs and cats, nobody's trying to get them in a bikini. Nobody wants them to be beach body fit. And so, I do think that, again, grounding in activity just helps me. That's another lever that I can pull to remind them that we're actually making progress. And I will say it is a graduation, right? So, it's definitely a continuum or spectrum of activity. And what you'll find is that, he's starting to get up in the car, and that's great. That's progress. And then suddenly he's jumping up in the car, and it's like, hey, he's playing ball in the park. I mean, and you will find this restoration of again, the enjoyment of life. And that's when people stick with it. That's when adherence begins, because once people, and this is the same thing with our own human health, once you sort of gain functionality, utility, you don't want to let that go. Again, we always talk about mobility and flexibility and independent living in humans, but that's really the goal here as well, is to allow that dog or cat to enjoy being a dog or cat.
Quite right. So now that we know how to recognize it, let's talk a little bit about why weight gain happens in the first place. So you've described pet obesity as a disease rather than a discipline issue. What are we missing when the advice begins and ends with feed less and exercise more?
Right. Well, I'll start with the end, because the only treatments that we've had for the last 100 years were feed less, exercise more. And it just simply doesn't work for every client or every pet owner and every cause and case of obesity. That's really why it's so frustrating, because as veterinarians, we just haven't had great treatments, right? Now, obviously, there are going to be some medical interventions that are quickly, making their way through approval processes. We've already seen the huge improvements in human health with the GLP-1s and other types of weight loss drugs. And so, I do see a time coming in the very near future, Dr. Cara, when we have medical interventions that actually have different effects and impacts. So let's just, so the feed less, exercise more, it's been frustrating for us all, but it's all we've got for now, and it's all we've had. So when I look at the causes, the first thing I want to make sure our colleagues understand is it is multifactorial. I love the fact you said it's not always just a disease of discipline, right? This just isn't always due to overfeeding, although that is the number one preventable cause of obesity, right? Because a lot of the other causes, whether it's genetics, whether it's the microbiome, whether it's hormonal imbalances, whether it's diseases like hypothyroidism, for example, or even acromegaly in cats, right? So there are lots of other causes. Those are harder to prevent, right? So, those causes are going to probably take their impact and effects at some point, and I may be powerless or limited to mitigate some of those advances. But when it comes to overfeeding, overtreating, under-exercising, those are preventable. So for me, it's really going to be how do we focus on the preventable, which will always be important. That's overfeeding, under-exercising. But then once we have these other types of conditions, and once you have established obesity, how do you treat it, right? Because it is difficult to sort of diet and exercise your way out of obesity, which is why we've had such poor success in human medicine, human obesity medicine. And so I do think that this will be one of those extra tools that we need, where we have to get better as a veterinary profession. And the things that what I've been working on very hard the last 5 years is changing the diagnostic criterion, how we diagnose. Again, we talked about language today, but being precise, we use the terms now clinical obesity and preclinical obesity, which is, maybe not so interesting to the pet owners out there listening to this, but from a veterinary perspective, this makes all the difference in the world, because we're going to have to establish thresholds for when we would potentially prescribe a medical intervention as to when we would maybe rely on a prevention type of intervention.
I mean, you describe obviously the barriers as biological, emotional, and practical. What belongs in each of those categories?
Yeah, biological, some of the things we talked about. And I think hormonal imbalances are a bigger deal than we even sort of know. We talked about like cortisol with acromegaly in cats and thyroid disease. But, again, there's a lot more to that sort of story, including a lot of the estrogens and estrogen-like compounds that fat produces. So once you have excess body fat, you actually kind of make things worse. Your body gets more efficient at actually creating more fat and storing more excess energy as fat. So the biological is going to be all those diseases. It's going to be genetics, right? It's going to be injuries, maybe that reduce your ability to physically act and burn calories that way. So we have a whole host of biological things. The other thing, of course, is going to be sort of when we look at the emotional, and that's the drive to feed our pets. But more importantly, the food drive, which also gets us back to one particular genetic influence. There's a gene deletion called the POMC gene, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Dr. Cara, but we've seen that is directly correlated with food drive intensity in certain dogs. And of course, Labradors have been the species most studied with this particular genetic defect. But the reality is, again, they can have all kinds of emotional. And then people, of course, feel this craving to share affection. And so we make, again, sort of a big act out of feeding and treating and all those types of things and allowing the pet not to, go out there. And then I think, really when we look at that lifestyle, we live in many parts of the world are highly urbanized. And so they don't have access to the environment. They can't go play. I mean, you're in beautiful South Africa where you have maybe more green spaces, but, to the person who lives in Philadelphia, New York City, and LA, it can be a real challenge to actually get their dog adequate exercise, and then of course there can be even a hidden risk of going to a dog park. And so, I think all these factors start to add up into this perfect storm that just makes it more likely. We call the term we use is obesogenic environment, but we really do. And honestly, Dr. Cara, then you look at how calorically dense and highly palatable dog and cat food and treats are today. The dog and cat foods of today are not what they were 50 years ago. They have lots of fat. They taste great, and again, we call them little kibble grenades, but these little treats can pack, an entire day's worth of treat allowance, in one little bitty kibble thing. So it kind of breaks my heart to all those factors make it very hard for that pet owner who's concerned, who really wants to do the best thing for their pet. I don't believe any pet parent parent out there that's watching this or ever sees me actually set out intentionally to cause obesity in their dog or cat. I don't believe that. That's why, again, I don't blame and shame. But I do know that the cards are stacked against them, that the obesogenic factors that exist in their world are real, that the pressures to give these treats, that they don't know how to train properly. I mean, the factors are, I mean, again, they're just overwhelming and innumerable. But Dr. Carr, again, our job as veterinary healthcare professionals is to sift through all this data, but apply it individually, right? And look at that dog or cat across from you on that exam room floor and say, okay, here's what the situation is, and here's my best point of attack to try to help obviate this disease.
Dr. Ward, I promised my listeners that I would ask you this question because this is probably a topic that comes up way too much, and this one is definitely for you. How much can neutering change an animal's energy requirements? Should we be spaying and castrating our pets?
Yeah, great question, and one of considerable controversy and really a little bit of confusion. One of my colleagues, one of the top experts in the world, happens to be a South African, Dr. Kurt de Kramer. And in fact, I'm so happy he contributed a fantastic chapter on this very topic in my upcoming veterinary clinical obesity textbook. But Dr. Carr, it's profound. Whenever we remove the reproductive organs from a dog or a cat or any mammal, as far as we know, we're going to greatly reduce the need for calories. Why? Because one of the things that we do is reproduce. That's just what we're designed to do biologically. So when you remove all of those systems, well, suddenly now there's a void, and if you continue to feed the same amount, it's going to be an excess amount. So we know that first and foremost, there's a direct relationship between spaying and neutering and caloric needs, metabolism, metabolic needs. Okay, so that's clearly established. Where it gets a little controversial is then when should you spay or neuter? And I think that clearly now the evidence is whenever possible. And again, we're going to have to eliminate shelter types of environments, stray animals, right? Because those are different issues altogether. But if it's a responsible pet owner in front of me with a dog or a cat, we are going to start to delay maybe from the historic. So now we're going to say, can we get to skeletal maturity for that individual safely? Can the owner, again, prevent unwanted pregnancy? I mean, all those kind of factors. But if we can, then we're going to delay because that impact on skeletal muscle mass and all the other biological and physiological systems is significant. So if we can, we should. All right. And again, we've seen this all around the world, and different countries have different sort of cultural norms for this. But, in the United States, we still tend to spay around 6 months of age, which is probably too young for many of the patients that we're seeing. Again, only if certain requirements, if that person can and is willing to continue to have them unspayed or neutered during that time period. But getting back to that, real question, I do think that there are probably other ways that we could do this. I mean, there's a lot of research being done about hormone replacements. So maybe you do spay or neuter them earlier in life, but then you would maybe help prevent some of these consequences by providing exogenous hormones. So there are some people that are doing very interesting research in that area. But I think overall, it comes right back down to the individual. And, as a person who I wear two hats, right? Number one, we do prevalence surveys in the United States and Canada, and we're working in Europe and South America. So, we're kind of looking around the world at prevalence from a big public, sort of standing vanguard perspective, right? But then obesity medicine comes down to the individual, and that's really where we have to sort of focus. So that decision, spay or neuter, that impact has to come down to that personal one-on-one discussion between you and your veterinarian. And again, sometimes it's going to be more appropriate to spay and neuter early. Sometimes it's going to be better to delay it. But we do need to understand the consequences of both. And I think, Dr. Carr, that's been the one thing that and again, I'm involved with the World Small Animal Veterinary Association, WSAVA, and Dr. de Kramer was also on this. We recently published about a year and a half ago spay-neuter guidelines. And of course, that was one of the big issues that is brought up in those guidelines is that, again, obesity is directly related. So what can we do to reduce that risk? And, I don't have that perfect answer for everybody. I've given you the general tenets of it, but I do think it's a really important conversation to have. And as veterinarians, we need to tell people the consequences. We need to explain to them more, I think, adequately the risk. And I think that's one of the things that, especially in the United States and Canada, we probably need to do a better job of.
So does recognizing biological susceptibility change the plan. So mainly change the amount of support and monitoring that these particular animals need.
Yeah, Dr. Carr, you nailed it, right? I think that the awareness of causality doesn't necessarily change the outcome. Like just knowing what's causing a disease doesn't change it. But what it can do is help with the conversations and the adherence to the program. Because I think that, again, if we view this as a lifestyle choice, if we blame and shame our clients, we say, you just got to feed them less, you just got to exercise more. Well, then again, not only does that build a chasm between the profession and the pet owning public, but they're not going to listen to our other recommendations either, right? So now there are downstream effects. I mean, this is a big, collateral issue in my opinion. So getting back, to the whole, question of how do we actually, understand the causes and how does that link up to it? I will say this. What it does for me as a veterinarian is it validates it as a multifactorial disease state. It creates urgency within me because I know now that there's biological processes that are causing this disease. And so what I hope is that maybe the next generation of veterinary professionals will have a mindset that they don't walk in the room judging the client for obesity, but they instantly go in and say, this is a disease no different than cancer or osteoarthritis or chronic kidney disease or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, right? They go in there and say, this is just another disease. It has real biological foundations and I have real interventions. And I think that, Dr. Carr, in my short time, I've been a veterinarian now for 35 years. In that short amount of time, I've seen a big shift. And so I can only imagine with great hope and aspirations what the next 35 years is going to look like when it comes to obesity medicine and companion animals.
It's a really, it's a hot topic for a reason. And I love that we're having this because it's something that, we don't necessarily always see it on the consult list as this animal's coming in with this issue, but it arrives sometimes disguised as something else.
It's unannounced. It's not welcome, but it arrives.
So when you are having a consultation in a household where several people feed the pet, how do you uncover the total intake without making anyone feel accused?
Yeah, great question. And this is one of the biggest, most pressing problems, right? Because there's so many different, as I used to say, hands in the food jar, right? For the pets that we see. One of the things that I've done, and I've written a lot, I've written several textbook chapters. I go into this in great detail in my own textbook, but we do what's called a narrative nutritional history. And so I have found that by asking people, how much do you feed your dog or cat? What do you feed them? You get very wide variety of answers, and most of them are highly inaccurate, right? Because A, the client feels like they're being judged. So they'll probably tell you, they may have walked in your lobby and seen a bag or brand of dog food and tell you they feed that just because they don't want to get into some kind of argument with you, right? And of course, everybody underestimates feeding, both for themselves and of course their pets. So we know that that's an inaccurate way to try to assess a nutritional history. So I will tell you, and I know vets at first, they laugh this off and they are scared to do this, but this is the simplest way to do it. I usually have my veterinary nurses or technicians do this, but we start off with a simple question. Hey, Mrs. Smith, so glad to see you today, blah, blah, blah. So listen, just to start, tell me about a typical day in Buster's life. And what that does is two things. Number one, the person is shock and awe. They're like, wait, what? Nobody's ever asked me a question like this. What do they want to do? They don't know how to answer it. So I'll tell you, Dr. Carr, 90% of the time, this is what they say. Oh, just normal stuff. It's just like any other dog because they don't know how to respond. Their physicians never ask them that. Their vets never ask them
they
that.
want to get to it.
That's right. So then you have to probe a little further. Well, Doug, listen, I'm trying to establish, we're just trying to figure out the lifestyle and how we can maybe help. So it's like what time do you guys get up? Like, what's the first thing you guys do? Once you start that little prime conversation, suddenly now most of these people will very quickly summarize it. And, most vets are like, oh, that's going to take an hour. Guys, I can barely get 5 minutes out of most clients, right? But they will kind of give you a good rough sketch whenever you say, tell me about a day in the life of. And it typically will look like something like, well, we get up like at 7 in the morning, I usually take him out for a walk and, and then we bring him back in, I give him his breakfast or whatever, and then we take him back out, and usually give him a little treat before I go off to work or whatever. Okay, great, And so now as you're bringing them along, you're taking notes, and what you're going to find is most people just naturally, and they're still not revealing all, but they're going to give you about 3 to 4 treat instances per day and for most dogs. And now we're seeing more and more cats are getting a couple of instances of treats because, again, getting back to that guilty feeling, that emotional part of this whole trifecta of obesity. And so that narrative nutritional history, if you can just get them to tell the story, and sometimes you have to kind of poke and prod and move along. So when you get home, like, you give him any treats, then you take him for a walk, what do? What you're going to find is A, you're going to get a little more information. B, you're going to most likely get more reports of treats and less reports of physical activity than if you just ask people questions like, so how many minutes a day do you think you walk, Buster? Right? Because now people are like, what? And we know the average American dog is getting far less than 30 minutes of aerobic activity a day, right? In our surveys, we find it's less than 15 minutes. And again, Dr. Cara, that's just inadequate, not only for physiological issues and health and just lively, being good and healthy, but also for emotional and intellectual stimulation, right? That's just not enough. And so obviously cats are more complicated, but even with cats, that narrative nutritional history can help you uncover, what we call the all-day buffet. Because a lot of people, if you ask them what they feed their cat, they'll tell you what they actually put in the bowl. They just forgot the one big bowl that they leave out for all the cats, And again, this does help us identify, as you mentioned before, multiple personnel in the family giving treats, because suddenly now if it's the lady in the room and maybe they have a partner and they didn't mention anything about the partners or the kids, then you could say, so what about your partner? Do they do anything? Do they give them any treats or any foods during the day? Oh yeah, I mean, of course, when they come home, we do this or whatever. What about the kids? Oh, the kids are always dropping food from the table. I mean, there are all those little bits that add up, and that's really the biggest. That's the biggest value of a more thorough nutritional assessment, because we're trying to identify where the extra calories are coming from. Yeah. And I'll tell you, Dr. Cara, one of the most fascinating things we did, this goes back to 2006 at the Association for Pet Obesity Prevention. I asked a simple question. I said, how much would you have to overfeed a small dog or a cat a day? And again, we were looking at dry dog and cat foods at the time. How much you have to overfeed them a day to gain a pound a year? That was the question I asked. So we got the top 10 dog and cat foods at that time. We did the math. We did the measurements. And Dr. Cara, it's astounding. It's about 10 extra kibbles a day equals a pound of weight gain a year. Now, this is just your typical, grocery store, pet store type of food. But you can see how imprecise a little extra feeding can be. And so, that really, I think when we published that, I think a lot of folks, kind of realized, wow, we've got to do a better job at actually measuring the feeding, talking about the food, because I've got to identify where are we losing them, right? And it's usually not just the extra treats. It's usually because of imprecise feeding. I mean, there's so many different areas, but I got to start by asking, and I got to get that information to do anything.
Yeah, and it gives you an opportunity to know where you can make the biggest recommendation in terms of change.
Great
I hear owners often say, and then he tends to finish the other dog's food.
Right.
So if you know that that's a problem, that's an easy thing for us to be able to solve, isn't it?
It really is. And I'm glad you mentioned because multi-pet households, that's always a challenge. And, I still call them food bowl bullies, right? Because there are going to be sort of social dynamics that interact between those two dogs or cats, and that could lead one to be more intimidated. And so again, that leads to one dog or cat dominating the food bowl and taking more than they should.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, all of this matters even more once extra body fat is no longer just something that we can see or feel, but is, as you said, affecting them health-wise. So we've used the term obesity as a medical disease. What turns excess body fat from a body conditioning finding, essentially, into a disease that requires active treatment?
Yeah, great question. And that's one of the reasons we've worked very hard on these 4 tiers and categorizations and sort of diagnostic algorithms for vets. I know that's a mouthful for some of the pet owners maybe listening to this, but it really is important for us to follow a logical, scientifically sound process for arriving at these distinctions, because they do matter. Because really the difference between like obesity, overweight, preclinical obesity, and clinical obesity are very significant, especially as we get into further modalities for weight loss. And so for me, we go back to that body condition score. Again, that measures body fat, right? It's an indirect proxy, but it's been validated. And obviously there are going to be inter-observer, variances. So meaning that one vet might score it slightly different than another. But we do know that we do have more consensus around obesity end of the scale than we do at the overweight. So basically when a veterinarian says this dog or cat has a body condition score of 8 or 9 on a scale of 9, which is the universal standardized scale, then we want to make sure that we take that very seriously. But it really does just boil down to body fat percentages, like to the actual answer to your question. It's the amount of body fat. So once you start getting north or above 35% body fat, that's when physiology and biology really is disrupted. Okay. I mean, obviously there are changes happening in the 30s for sure in the overweight category. But once you start getting, into 40, 45+%, then we really have problems with our physiology. This is where those diseases, right? Those complications of obesity, those diseases that are directly caused by excess adiposity, including many forms of cancer, all start to become a real issue. And so, getting back to that break, it boils down to body, condition scoring. We do hope, there are several interesting blood tests that maybe could help us with this in the future, right? So there's some interesting research being done there. There are different types of tools. People are probably familiar with like those DEXA scans that you can get at the fancy gyms and so forth. Electrical impedance or bioelectrical impedance monitors also show some promise. But, at the end of the day, it's still going to be that individual and trying to assess it. And for now, really a good set of eyes, a great set of hands can go a long way when it comes to describing and identifying and documenting obesity in dogs and cats.
And would you say that there are animals whose weight may not look dramatic, but whose health is already being affected?
Dr. Carr, this is really one of the most emerging topics. And, I don't like the term, but it does illustrate it. But, and because in the human medical literature, we're starting to try to come to grips with this. But the term that is loosely, casually used is called skinny fat. And basically, this describes an individual, a dog, cat, or a human, that actually has skinny appendicular skeleton, right? But a bulbous abdomen, right? So they have a large belly. And those people on their weight are within the normal range, right? So now you're looking at this person's weight and going, there may be a little towards the upper end of what we consider normal, but they're fine. But they're missing the point. These people have probably clinical obesity, or at least preclinical obesity in human vernacular. And so that determining where the fat deposition or the fat accumulation is, that is really the most important feature of this entire discussion, right? Because where that body fat is stored, the proximity to organs, that is what makes the biggest difference, right? Because body fat is active. It is biologically active. In fact, I call it biologically hyperactive. It is producing hundreds, if not thousands, of different kinds of what we call adipocytokines or cytokines. Sometimes we shorten it too. And these are just harmful compounds that mimic hormones and all types of chemicals, all types of catalysts. All kinds of things are happening that is secreting. And basically, that causes damage. So when we look at obesity, I don't see obesity, Dr. Carr. I see chronic inflammation. And again, that proximity to the liver, to the kidney, to the pancreas, to the intestinal tract, all of that, when we store that extra body fat in those organ areas, that makes them even more prone to problems moving on, which is why, again, when we look at obesity complications, it's going to be liver, it's going to be pancreas. Those are right at the top. And guess what else follows? The kidney. And of course, now we know there's an assortment of intestinal problems that are accompanying that, not in addition to heart and hypertension and so forth, musculoskeletal, just those biomechanical issues. So for me, it really is moving into that realm of understanding. It is not just the weight. It is the amount of body fat and where that body fat is being stored. And I'll tell you, there's some fascinating research that's still ongoing, but I think the story is yet to be fully understood because there even may be different types of fat tissues that are even more biologically or less, active.
Yeah. And I love the example that you used of having something actionable, jumping back on the bed or being able to jump in the car or, things that people have missed. But when you are discussing excess body fat, how do you describe that it impacts osteoarthritis and chronic pain in our pets?
Yeah, great question. So the link between osteoarthritis is really twofold. And I think one, everybody understands it's excessive loading forces, right? So when there's more weight concentrated on a knee or a hip or an elbow or a shoulder, you can see that it kind of breaks down. So, right. So we call that the wear and tear hypothesis. So whenever you are carrying extra weight, you're putting more pressure on those joints and they're more likely to break down or become injured. So that's, I think most of us associate, and we can think of that. It's mechanical, it's relatable. We can see that in the real world. But really, the bigger cause of osteoarthritis in particular is the chronic inflammation. And this is one of the things that when they first started really doing deep research into obesity medicine in humans, they started looking at why do these people have an increase in joint pain and osteoarthritis in their wrists? Why are their knuckles? Why are these people with obesity having, osteoarthritis in joints that aren't load bearing? And that led us back to inflammation. And so basically some of those things that biologically hyperactive tissue fat is causing is it's causing these chemicals that directly damage all the connective tissue. And those, of course, apply to the joints. So, Dr. Carr, it's really twofold. It's two prongs that are attacking joints. So osteoarthritis and obesity is just a big issue. And I'll tell you, don't forget our kitty cats. And I think that too often, because cats are so adept at masking their pain, and we really can't even tell if they're as active or not, right? Maybe they don't have the zoomies in the evening, but most folks cannot tell you how active or not their cat is, right? They can start to see demonstrations of being unable to get in the litter box or jump up on a counter, but that's about it. But we cannot overlook the fact that that cat who weighs 20 pounds, right? That puts them almost double their normal ideal weight. That cat is also going to have damage to its joints. And I think we're starting to see more and more of that. It's difficult to uncover. But again, I know we always make osteoarthritis about dogs, but do not forget our feline patients as well.
That's a good point. And how should weight reduction be approached when exercise itself is really painful?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, I also have my feet in a lot of different realms. I mentioned, I certified personal trainer. The weight loss equation, which is held up now for more than 50 years through repeated bouts of research, it looks loosely like this. If you want to know how to lose weight, what does it look like? Exercise and diet. So dogs and humans are very similar in our energy systems, right? That's one of the reasons why they're man's best friend, because actually we were great at going long distances together because we were burning calories at a similar rate for similar speeds. We had similar water needs and so forth. But if you want to lose weight and you're a person or a dog, the equation is pretty simple, backed by decades of evidence. It's about 60 to 70% diet and 30 to 40% physical or aerobic activity. Okay, so 70%, 30, you can divide it up like you want. For cats, which have a completely different energy system, they basically only use a form of sugar for short, fast bouts, right? These are the cats that can go top speed for 45 to 90 seconds, and then they've got to rest for hours. They have to recover for days, right? They use a form of glycogen, completely different energy system. 90% diet, Dr. Kara, about 10% physical activity, right? Because they're not burning those fats as a primary fuel source like we do and our dog companions. So when I look at that equation right there, maybe 70-30 for humans and dogs and 90-10 for cats, when you start to realize, wow, guess what? You can't exercise your way out of this. And this is why so many people get frustrated because, they go to the gym, they train for a 5K and they didn't lose any weight, right? And if they did lose it, they started losing strength. And so, again, we've got to be very precise and intentional with how we try to help these animals lose weight. And that's where we go back to those systems, therapeutic diets, a very curated exercise plan. But again, dogs can jog, and so we can do a little better job, especially if they don't have any mobility issues. But cats, it's going to be almost exclusively in the food bowl.
So fascinating. And for flat-faced dogs, the brachycephalics, or animals with existing respiratory disease, how much difference can apparent modest weight gain make?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because when we see these sort of dogs, the flat face, the pugs, the Frenchies, the ones that already have respiratory stridor and difficulty, number one, you can't put them on an exercise plan, right? Because you're probably going to tip them over into potential crisis, right? So we got to be super careful with those dogs. Don't tell that owner, well, go run him at the park, because that could have unwanted consequences. But the difference is profound. There are some interesting studies and they're very limited, but when we do look at storage, especially in the oral cavity of some of these breeds, just a small amount of extra fat stored in these areas. And again, so now you're looking at a dog with obesity, that can make a profound difference in breathing ability to breathe. We also see differences especially in diaphragmatic excursion, which is one of the areas that all dogs are affected, not just the flat face or flat nosed dogs as you referred to, but basically when you have that excess abdominal adiposity, this changes the way the diaphragm can expand, filling the lungs. And this can have significant impacts for anesthesia, right? So again, just back to my veterinary colleagues, we do have to monitor and actually deliver ventilation in a different fashion for a dog or cat with obesity than we would in normal. So you're absolutely right. We can make a huge difference. I will say this, I'm always reticent, Dr. Cara, to say, okay, if I have a Frenchie and it has obesity, if it loses that extra weight, will the breathing get better? Because again, it's multifactorial. Those guys already have the odds stacked far against them. And so, I'm just hesitant to say that will cure it, but it will improve it, especially for those marginal cases. It can help. And a lot of those dogs, as you and I know all too well, they ultimately require surgery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, one of your recent surveys, and please correct me if I'm wrong, found that only about 1 in 4 dog owners and fewer than 1 in 5 cat owners who attempted weight loss reported reaching and maintaining a healthy body condition. Why are they failing, and what are they failing to address?
Yeah. And again, I always have to look inward. I have to say, what did I not do? Right. So again, I can't blame the client. I think it's multifactorial, but I think the biggest is the tools aren't very good. It's feeding less, exercise more, literally. And that is very difficult to sustain. And if it did work, Dr. Cara, we would not be in the situation with human obesity that we see globally, right? So, we know it sounds so simple and it sounds so achievable, but so few actually do. So we know that it's confounding. I think that poor tools. So, it's just difficult to precisely feed. It's difficult to exercise for a lot of reasons, including some of our own limitations, but that's difficult. Then you start to look at the foods. The foods are very sophisticated and they're designed to do one thing, get your dog or cat to eat more of it. And then to make you feel like, oh, wow, I'm doing them a favor. They love it so much. I love them. This is how I show love. So again, we have that whole emotional part of it. But ultimately, I think the biggest issue is people don't understand the consequences. And so now I'm dealing with that cat and it's 13 pounds, right? It should weigh 10 pounds, let's just say in this example. And I see diabetes on the horizon, okay? They don't understand it. They just say, he's happy. Look at him, he's getting around. There's no problem here. They can't see the future that I know is looming. And so that's the part, that awareness, this is why, again, not going back to your first question, precise language, medical language, being logical in how we actually diagnose and assess these patients. I think that's really where it starts, because what we've done poorly as a profession, again, I have to put all the blame on me, is articulate the consequences. And I still say this, and I know a lot of my colleagues don't like it when I say this, but it's so true. For the client, obesity isn't a problem until it's a catastrophe. Now, if you just take that and sum it up, it's never a problem until suddenly now the dog literally can't do the thing that it needs to do. The cat starts having litter box they're having elimination problems all throughout the house. I mean, it's those types of catastrophes. The dog now has a joint that is, they ruptured their cruciate, they've blown out their elbows. I mean, that catastrophe is then when people go, oh, I get it now. And sadly, for many, it's too late.
No, it's dreadful. And I mean, obviously, historically, we used to talk calorie aims or cup measures. Why is that so difficult for owners?
Yeah, great question. And I think mainly, again, we get back to this, we have the wrong tools. I mean, this is a predictable outcome of imprecise feeding tools. So a feeding cup is using a volume to feed something that we are calculating by mass. So the shape size, the amount of air, how you pack the food, the actual device itself, all those can add up to those small incremental changes I mentioned earlier. And if you just kind of guess 10 extra kibbles a day equals a pound of weight gain a year. Well, you can see again how imprecision. And I'll tell you that is the one thing, portion control is critical with this. And, for a long time, I would tell people whenever I started a weight loss journey, especially when it was a person, and, it's very hard to get a person to weigh the food every feeding, right? I mean, that's just a big ask for a lot of my clients. So what I would do is I would put them on a canned diet. And why did I put them on a canned diet? Was there some special ingredient or special mixture? No, it was because I was containing the portions, right? I could say, well, if you're feeding a can a day, you'd have to open up another one to give, at least I know how many calories you got, right? So we could get closer to actually how many calories I wanted to deliver to that dog or cat. Well, now we've got some fresh food options, especially here in the United States and in Europe, that actually can now more precisely do those portions. So we can actually calculate, and these companies, produce all these types of diets that can help out. So I do think that portion control is a huge part of this, but where it makes the most impact, Dr. Cara, is in the prevention stage, right? I think that all of this is just too late. The cat with 20 pounds, that's now going to take 20 months, or I'm sorry, 40 months probably to lose that weight. It's going to take, years. And that's unachievable for most folks. And so for me, it's really portion control, precision measuring and feeding that is most important in the prevention of obesity. Once we have obesity, this becomes a poor treatment choice, in my opinion. And this is why, again, you're starting to see the advent of all these really incredible life-changing drugs that I think ultimately will make their way into veterinary medicine. And I think that's when the game really gets changed. But for me, it will always be about preventing this disease. I would rather prevent cancer than treat cancer. No matter how good and reliable the treatments were, I'd still rather not have it if at all possible. And I think that as we move forward in medicine, you clearly start to see most diseases break off into those kinds of stages where it's like, okay, you can do some things to mitigate or reduce your risk of it, but when you got it, we got to treat it. And I think obesity will be the same way.
And I mean, I really appreciate the way you describe sort of even suggesting, and I see the practicality of saying a tin, this is what your can of food or the pouch of whatever it may be, whatever format. But how do you manage the conversation around treats? And I think probably from a personal experience, I find this the hardest conversation because, as you say, people sometimes are or owners are not always aware of how many they give and the impact obviously on their pets longer term. So whether it's like managing an already pre-existing condition or preventing, what is your conversation around treats?
Yeah, great question. I got pretty famous in the US and in the UK in the early 2000s because of a demonstration I was doing. I was on a popular TV show at the time and, then just wound up going on a lot of TV shows for this demonstration, but it was a simple demonstration. I took like some of the most common dog treats out there, right? And again, we could apply this to cats as well, but it's dog because dog treat business was huge, especially if you go back, 20 years. And so what I did was I would show, okay, so here's a little dog cookie, here's a dog, bone, right? If this were your treat, it would be, and I would show like 3 milkshakes, right? I would show like 4 hamburgers, or I would show like 2 boxes of fries. And so that analogy, I mean, you can imagine that resonated. It was very visual. The public got it and they're like, wait, what? I was like, yeah, so if you give this to your 20-pound dog, you get to have 2 milkshakes, So that kind of analogy, and we have tons of these examples on our website that the vets can kind of refer to. But I think number one, articulating the concentration of calories in a small volume, because again, they see it as a small little kibble. We see it as a grenade of calories. Okay. It's a large amount. The second thing is don't take away treats, because if you take away treats, you are now asking the client, the pet owner, to deprive themselves of joy. And there is great joy. I give my dogs and cats treats every day, but we do have to teach them the proper amounts of treats and the proper types of treats. And I will say this, going back 20 years ago, most of the calories were kind of in a race to the most. And so these were the most palatable. They wanted bigger sizes. They wanted those things that dogs just went nuts for, right? In fact, they even called some of them things that was like, for begging and so forth, right? Because they knew what they were doing from an emotional lever pulling standpoint. But what we try to do is then teach them, and we have better solutions today. So there are some amazing treats out there that are very low calorie. And we're looking, Dr. Cara, I'm looking for single digit calorie treats, okay? And they exist. And so now you start to say, okay, let's give this treat. You can give 5 of these a day. And suddenly now people are like, okay, it's not the same as I used to give, but that's what Dr. Ward says. So you can definitely apply better strategies for treats. Of course, I love natural options, so I continue to be a huge fan of anything. I love baby carrots for dogs, that crunchy sensation. A lot of dogs love it, right? Broccoli, asparagus, celery, you can do so many good things. I do berries and bananas and things like that, but again, you got to watch the calories, but they are super healthy. My own dog, I give her 4 blueberries a day. She's a border terrier, so she's a smallish dog. But again, I love all the phytochemicals contained in blueberries, but it's just getting more strategic and thoughtful about treats. But at the end of the day, Cara, don't ever take treats away. Don't take them off the table. Don't say you can't give cookies to your dog or cat. You really want to now say, let's give better, healthier choices. And again, I will say one thing too. Don't ever present this or frame it as a forever situation, right? Because sometimes now they go, oh no, I'm not going to, if I have to do this the rest of the dog's life, it's not going to make him happy or bring him joy. But you are trying to get them to adjust to differences. And so if you say, look, right now, what I want to focus on is for the next 3 months, let's just try this, right? And if you can give them that very finite timeline, and again, 3 months may be too much for certain clients, right? We may go for 2 weeks in certain instances. But for me, it's always making it a very finite, approachable sort of strategy or step, and then we're going to move into it. And you can kind of see, it's all anchored back, 25 years ago in this step weight loss, because I was so frustrated. You can kind of hear it coming out even in treats. But I would say if you're a veterinarian or a veterinary professional watching this, really take that to heart, because, we now know the biology and the physiology changes, but for me, it's still that emotional issue. And I think people do a lot better with a compressed, constrained timeline. If you were going to the gym and your trainer, you said, look, what's your goal? Well, I want to be in beach body shape by spring. And the guy says, no way, it's going to take you a year to get there. You're walking out. You're just going to abandon. You're never going to start, right? Now, if that guy said, great, I love that goal. Here's what we're going to do. For the next 3 weeks, we're going to do right? Then you're going to say, all right, I'm going to try this for 3 weeks. Sounds pretty intense, but then you have a better chance of sustaining it for a year or whatever it really takes. And hopefully, for most of us, this should be a lifelong endeavor, not just a one-off.
So other than time frame, what are the early signs that suggest that a weight loss plan is too restrictive or poorly tolerated?
Yeah, great point. And that's really the biggest danger. If it's too restrictive, if it's, I always say this, weight loss is not about deprivation or starvation, right? We just mentioned deprivation, but now we're in starvation. And so if you reduce the calories too much, then you're going to make the body go and get calories where it shouldn't, which is going to be lean muscle mass. And so for me, that's why we were talking earlier about these rates, these safe weights and rates. And, it's like, boy, it's limiting, and people really need to do the physiological math, because it's a lot more, again, constrained than you might think, but it really is about preserving muscle mass. And that is a very tough needle to thread sometimes, right? So I will always go in this direction. And I know a lot of my colleagues disagree, but I will always slow weight loss if I'm ever in fear of losing muscle mass, right? So this is why a lot of times when I'm lecturing and writing, they'll go, well, Dr. Ward, that seems a little conservative. We can do X amount, or this person says that amount. I said, and great. And that might work in a certain situation. But for me, I also am going to be a lot more conservative with weight loss, because 2 things. Number one, we already mentioned all the emotional cues around that. And so if I can make this more palatable, less begging and pestering and all those other unwanted behaviors, the cat pouncing on you at 3 a.m. saying, wake up and give me some food. If I can reduce those as much as possible, then the client's going to be more likely to adhere to it. And at the same time, if I can preserve muscle mass on the other side of weight loss, now I'm going to have a physically strong, not a frail patient. And I think too often vets get too aggressive because, again, as we mentioned before, they aren't seeing the results that they want to see. Yeah. So they go a little more. And then we're now knocking macronutrients of proteins and carbs and fats down too much. And the body goes somewhere, and that's the muscle.
We made mention of the fact that it's particularly important in cats. What can rapid weight loss be dangerous for in our feline patients?
Yeah, cats are unique, and we mentioned they have different energy systems, and so it's a very different equation. It's 90% diet, which is why, again, when we just put these crash diets on, they can really go south. It's called hepatic lipidosis, and in simplest terms, the way I explain it to my clients is, Okay, your cat has stored a lot of extra fat in its abdomen, okay? And part of that fat, of course, can be used for energy, but cats are really lousy at moving energy out of fat and into the body for use, into the bloodstream. Now, dogs and people, we're great. That's what we prefer, right? But cats are not. They're not designed that way. What they do is they use a form of sugar called glycogen. And that's what they draw on to do those bursts of speed. That's why your cat has the zoomies in the evening. Well, now, where do you store that glycogen, you say? Well, guess what? There's two primary resources or reservoirs of it: skeletal muscle, liver. So now if you suddenly reduce the calories, that cat's going, I'm really bad at mobilizing fat for energy. You're not feeding me any carbs or anything, any food that I can use. So what am I going to do? I'm going to start pulling that sugar, that form of glycogen, out of the liver, out of the skeletal muscle. And if you do that too quickly, you now disrupt the liver function, and they can go into liver failure within 72 hours. And so for me, it's always be very cautious, be very slow with that weight loss or that caloric restriction. Go back to these steps, it really does make a lot of difference. And a lot of times, Dr. Carr, I am literally reducing some of these cats by 30 to 50 calories a day, not much, and so people are like, well, I'm barely feeding any less, but that really is the safest way to approach it, because there are severe consequences. For dogs, the biggest thing, of course, is losing skeletal muscle mass, lean muscle mass. And it actually happens at a higher rate than I think we're fully aware of. Some of the newer studies show that these dogs are losing muscle mass at a higher rate than we once anticipated, simply because dogs can mask it more. They typically are better at ambulation, and moving around. But especially if it's an older dog and you're now putting it on a calorically restricted diet, Dr. Carr, they'll start to have frailty. They'll start to have difficulty moving around. And again, that can lead to all sorts of other problems.
Mm-hmm. Are there other useful ways of replacing some of the food rewards that people are very prone to wanting to give, with things like attention and play, training, or other environmental enrichment?
Yeah, I love that. I used to always say, affection is not confection, right? Because we do tend to think of it in terms of rewarding our dogs with food, right? But you're right. The best thing you can do is to give them interaction, your time, your presence, playing with them. I used to tell, and I still tell a lot of my clients, every time you feel like you want to give your dog a treat, ask yourself, can I do one of two things? One, can I take my dog outside? Two, can I put my dog in my lap or sit on the floor and pet them, right? Because if you can say yes to either of those, then you should probably replace that treat impulse with some type of interaction. And so I think that's very important to call out to people, to give them an action. But again, raise awareness and say, hey, look, every time you want to give that treat, that extra treat, ask yourself one of these two questions. And then again, let them sort of do what they want. For cats, we are seeing an increase in the number of treat sales in the United States and in Europe. And so this is now, 20 years ago, Dr. Carr, I wasn't talking about this, but now when you peruse the pet food aisle, wow, there's tons of choices for cat treats. And so I think we've got to do a better job of having those conversations. A lot of people are sort of, giving these little extras when they go out for work or when they go out for the evening or school or whatever it may be. And we've got to start to get that. Again, we talked about narrative nutritional history, uncovering that extra treat. A lot of these clients don't even realize that it's just extra unneeded calories. A lot of those treats for cats are very, what I call nutritionally vacant. They just don't have a lot of good stuff to help maintain health. And so for me, it really is, do not take treats away, but let's again give healthy treats whenever possible.
I don't want to lose the opportunity to ask you this, and I know we're running out of time, but once a target body condition is reached, why is the maintenance a separate treatment phase rather than the end of the problem?
Yeah, great question. Well, and there are two factors. Number one, we know that if a human, a dog or a cat or many other mammalian species have obesity, they've increased their risk of several complications and comorbidities, right? So that the problem is once we remove the excess fat, so like let's say we go on this health journey, we didn't remove that injury to those organ systems. So that's where it's a little bit disappointing. Now, the great news is the shorter the amount of time that you have this excess adiposity state, then the less the chances of bad things happening, right? So it's sort of like, curing cancer early is a lot better outcome long-term than if we wait till late in the course of the disease. Because, I used to sort of jokingly refer to the obesity spreads, right? I mean, and not just physically, but the impacts physiologically. And so we want to address this as quickly as early as possible. It's one of the reasons why some of the human weight loss medical drugs, they talk about rate of loss, because they know that's actually a very important factor in long-term survival and outcomes. So for me, it's really, about getting that to that healthy ideal state, body composition, as quickly as possible, as safely as possible, and then maintaining it for the rest of their life. I will say the earlier this is done, the better. But at the end of the day, this is it. As I used to say, it's never too late to change your lifestyle or stop smoking. And I think if you kind of apply that in a very specific or broad sense, you get exactly where I'm going with that. And it's really important. It's never too late, always has positive impacts. But guess what? If you stop smoking, if you get healthier earlier, you have even better outcomes.
And other than that great take home, if someone remembers only one idea from this conversation today, what should it be?
That obesity is a multifactorial disease, that it is not always the fault of the owner, that there are so many biological issues and factors that go and contribute to obesity, that as a profession, we need to sit back and say, this is a disease state. I need to treat it seriously. I need to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to prevent it.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Ward. This has been really insightful. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I can't wait for my colleagues to hear it, but also my listeners, who I think are going to appreciate just all the nuance around obesity and how we really can make a difference in our pets' lives. So I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for all that you're doing, because your efforts are making such a big difference in the world. And Dr. Cara, I am a big believer of the drop in the bucket philosophy, and we all have to add our drop to that bucket or we'll never fill it. You're filling that bucket.
Oh, thank you. And so are you. It's been great to meet you. And hopefully at some point we can have another conversation about your book. And probably there are so many topics here that we haven't covered today, including obviously some of the neuroemergence like drugs that are going to be on the market probably before we can blink. It's going to be very interesting.
Yes, very. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
You look at me, I look at you, I see the love in your eyes. I'm lost in
Health you can see, love you can feel. Ultra Pet, the science of love.